Thank you all very, very, very much for coming along on a Sunday to the Chowchakwing Museum. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we gather on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. And today I'm really excited to close out our Kafenio weekend that's been sponsored by the Aroney Trust Estate for Greek cultural programs and heritage and to celebrate Greek culture. And we've been thrilled at how so many people have embraced coming along to the museum to play games, to get together with old friends, to have a coffee and really kind of connect with the collections here on campus. And of course, we chose the theme of board games because it's it is absolutely a part of Greek history and Greek legacy. And it's that we're going to explore today with Dr. Stavros Paspalas from the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens. Stavros has worked with the Chowchakwing Museum and with Craig and myself here at for the Nicholson Collection for many, many years now. Stavros has expertise in Greek archaeology, art and heritage, and runs the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens excavations at the unmute. Sorry for people at home if you didn't hear the introduction, but you'll hear the lecture. Anyway, so yes, to round it out, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Dr. Stavros Paspalas to give his first lecture in the new Chowchakwing Museum and join us today. So thank you, Stavros.
Thank you, Candice. And I'd like to thank the Greek Festival of Sydney for incorporating all of the activities that have taken place since Thursday under its banner. And more importantly, to thank the Nicholas Anthony Aroney Trust for the generosity and vision in supporting the activities of the Chowchakwing Museum and the Institute in promoting the Nicholson collection here in this museum and matters Greek more broadly. I suspect that for most of us, our relationship with the modern board games is a relatively straightforward, innocent one. A childhood pursuit that is reactivated in later years when we ourselves are charged with entertaining the children of a younger generation. We recognize the educational value of board games alongside their socializing role. Board games of a more challenging nature, backgammon and chess, and more recently developed ones, among them, fall into a different category, one that is reserved for children, for older children and adults. Adult enthusiasts, of course, exist for both categories and dedicate themselves most seriously to their chosen board games. I doubt, though, that there are many of us who conceive of such games in various roles associated with life and death as the Greeks of antiquity did. In the early 5th century BC, the poet Pindar could write that in blissful... Okay, so why is this not moving now? Oh, there, thank you. Pindar could write that in blissful death, some take pleasure in horses, others in playing board games, others with their lyres. Here, Pindar presents us with a vignette of aristocratic pursuits translated to eternity. In real life, horses and their maintenance could only be afforded by the wealthy. Music and poetry making, although undoubtedly widespread, was another pursuit that marked the cultured best of society, especially when accompanied by the lyre, considered to be the most noble of instruments. And alongside these aristocratic activities, we find board games. Pindar and his elite audience, at least, found these pursuits naturally linked and expected that a good afterlife would include all three. This view of board games, and even more so of related dicing, was not, as we shall see, universally shared throughout Greek antiquity, but it did exercise a strong hold on the Greek imagination as it is preserved in the literary sources and the iconographical record. Arguably, the most emblematic image of a board game that has survived from Greek antiquity is that on an Attic amphora, now in the Vatican, which pictures the great heroes Achilles and Ajax at a gaming board. It was made in Athens in about 540 and stands very close to the beginning of a series of scenes that were painted on Attic pots for the next, in the main, 60 years or so. Exekius, who signed the amphora as both potter and painter, has endowed this representation with a psychological force which has never failed to impress since the amphora's discovery in a Etruscan grave in Vulci in the 19th century. Nearly 170 variations of this scene have been identified on fine Athenian pots, ranging from brilliantly executed examples, such as Exekius's, to mere hackwork. 10 of them actually identify, by way of inscriptions, the protagonists as Achilles and Ajax, as does Exekius's. 10 to 20 years after the earliest known example of the scene, a variant appears in which Athena stands between the players, behind or in front of the gaming table. She invariably looks towards Achilles as if to encourage him or grant him her favor, in much the same way that Zeus looks towards Heracles and so bestows upon him his divine sanction in his duel against Kyknos on one of the Nicholson collection's finest Attic vases. On some other scenes, to return to Achilles and Ajax, Athena's position is taken by a palm tree, often, but by no means exclusively, used by Attic vase painters as a shorthand to refer to Troy and its environs. Achilles and Ajax are not an incidental pairing. They weren't only two of the major Greek heroes at Troy, both destined to die there, albeit under very different circumstances. And it has often been pointed out that their camps bookended the Greek installations on the coast of Troy, fitting positions for the foremost of the invading warriors. Achilles and Ajax were also close relatives, first cousins, in fact, warriors in arms and kinsmen. Furthermore, they shared one characteristic, we will call it supernatural, at least according to later sources. They were invulnerable unless their assailant found the one weak spot on their body. This is widely known with regard to Achilles. His heel, actually his ankle, according to most ancient authors, would prove to be fatal, given that he was held from it by his mother when she dipped him as an infant into the river Styx, thus rendering the rest of his body invulnerable, except for the spot from which he was held. Ajax's story is less well known, but we generally know less about Ajax than we do about his greater cousin. Suffice to say that a number of ancient authors report when Heracles visited Ajax's father's house, he swaddled the then infant Ajax in his lion skin, thus rendering him invincible, except for the one spot which the skin did not cover. Unfortunately, we do not know where this critical vulnerable spot was located, but it is clear from the way in which Ajax's story develops that he knew all too well. And of course, it was Ajax who retrieved Achilles' body from the battlefield once Paris's arrow, guided by Apollo, had found the hero's vulnerable spot, as shown on the Nicholson collection's Alexander Campidoglou amphora on display downstairs. But to return to Exekius's gaming scene, we see the two heroes in deep concentration over the game. Achilles is on our left, Ajax to our right. Between them, there is a block towards which the two warriors reach. Ajax calls out 3, tria. Achilles, 4, tessera. There is no doubt that it is only appropriate for Achilles to have thrown the higher number, for he was the best of the Achaeans. His cousin was great, but Ajax could not surpass Achilles. Much ink has been expended on attempts to decipher this and the other 165 odd examples of the scene. No such event appears in the Homeric epics, nor in the summaries we have of other works which relate to the Trojan War. And we must always remember that the Iliad only covers part of the 9th year of hostilities, a small part at that. and the Odyssey does not add any relevant details as regards this board game. Furthermore, there is only one line in a lost play of unknown authorship, which Aristophanes quotes in his comedy, The Frogs, in which it is said that Achilles threw an unfavorable roll of the dice on some unknown occasion. So, not much to go on. One suggestion has been that the scenes testify to the existence of an epic episode that would have been told in verses now lost. Some of the scenes place the game players in the midst of a battle with fighting warriors to the left and right. Could the plot of such a purported lost poem have included an episode in which the heroes were so absorbed in their game that they did not heed the call to battle? This has been a popular suggestion, but there isn't any corroborating evidence to establish it as fact. Could Athena, when she appears, be rousing Achilles and Ajax from their board game trance so as to hear the bugle call? We simply don't know. Another suggestion would reject the existence of a literary source altogether and see a conscious transposition of a daily Athenian activity onto the heroic sphere, so naturalizing the heroes for an Athenian audience. And yet other researchers have argued that visual artists may have created the scene on the basis of folk stories, which were never incorporated into the epic poems, and which of course will forever be lost to us. There is no doubt that the scene did have great relevance to the Athenians. Achilles was a great pan-Hellenic hero. Ajax too was a major figure, but he also had some particularly Athenian associations. His homeland, the island of Salamis, was given, so Athenian accounts would have us believe, to the Athenians by his two sons, Eurylochus and Phileus, and Ajax received cult honors in Athens. He would, in the late 6th century, a few decades after the manufacture of the Exekius amphora, he would be chosen as one of the 10 eponymous heroes, heroes who encapsulated the mythological foundations of the Athenian state. And a few decades later yet, he would provide indispensable help to the Athenians at the Battle of Salamis against the Persian fleet. Most of the plot scenes predate these developments, and it has been suggested that the Athenian interest in Ajax-related stories may have reflected their territorial claims to the island of Salamis in a dispute with the neighboring city-state of Megara, which ran throughout the 6th century. Such an interest may possibly be reflected in a monument which the Athenians erected on the Acropolis, now only testified to by 2 fragments, and I show one here, alongside vase paintings in which 2 warriors are shown kneeling on either side of their gaming board. The Acropolis fragments have been tentatively, and I can't emphasize that word enough, restored on paper as 2 kneeling men, Achilles and Ajax playing a board game. This is a possibility, but not a certainty by any means. The sculptural group to which the 2 fragments I mentioned, and one of which I show on the screen, this group was destroyed by the Persians when they trashed the Acropolis in 480-79, and subsequently buried on the rock after the Athenians returned. I should point out here a slight sleight of hand. When I described the gaming scene on the Vatican amphora, I said that the accompanying inscriptions identified the 2 heroes. This is strictly correct, but not the full story, for their names are written in the genitive. That is, they are identified as of Achilles and of Ajax. The most straightforward explanation of this is that Exekius has represented representations of the heroes. Could he have had a sculptural group on the Acropolis in mind when decorating the amphora? If so, it would not be the one of which fragments are preserved, as they date later than his scene. One of the latest representations of the scene complicates matters further. It dates to about 440 and shows the heroes playing with Athena standing behind a block which serves as their gaming board. Athena, holding Nike, victory, is clearly based on Phidias's famous ivory and gold statue of the goddess commissioned for the Parthenon. What is of interest is that the whole group is shown on a base, normally associated with sculptural groups. Could the painter have rendered a representation of a statue group that replaced, as has been suggested in the Periclean period, the one destroyed in the Persian invasion? Given the lack of evidence, this suggestion is not susceptible to proof and indeed is imponderable. Whatever the answer to these riddles, the basic scene clearly had connotations which resonated with the Athenians, though many of the pots which bear it eventually were deposited in Etruscan graves in northern Italy, and the subject of the two heroes playing was adopted there in the different medium of engraved representations on bronze mirrors, so adding another field where it had currency. In Greece itself, the scene was also known more widely. We know this from some images which decorated the bronze bands on hoplite shields through which the soldier passed his arm so as to carry it in a defensive position. And I show a scene on which the shield bands of the two adversaries can be clearly seen, and an intact decorated shield band on the left. Many of these shield band images, best seen in drawings, depict episodes of the Trojan cycle, including our scene. They have been found in considerable numbers at Olympia and also on Aegina, and are believed to have been manufactured in the Peloponnese. The image of Achilles and Ajax intently focused on a gaming board was clearly known beyond Athens, though we, perforce, must remain heavily reliant on Athenian evidence. But what game are the heroes playing? Actually, are they playing a game at all? While most researchers have understood the scene on the Vatican Amphora as Achilles and Ajax engaged in a board game, others have suggested that they are actually casting lots before battle so as to see what the outcome will be. That such casting of lots was known to the Greeks is established. Dice of various kinds could have been used. The tragedian Aeschylus put it bluntly in his play Seven Against Thebes, where he wrote that Ares will judge the outcome of battle with a throw of the dice. Astragaloi, the knuckle bones of sheep and goats, could also be used. They gave number combinations based on their four major, more or less flattish sides, based on the numbers 1, 3, 4, and 6. Astragaloi have been found in numerous contexts, mainly sanctuaries and graves, and were children's playthings as well as means by which to predict the future. Excavations at the Korykeion cave of the nymphs on Mount Parnassus above Delphi uncovered over 22,000 astragaloi, either votive dedications made by adolescents exiting their childhood or the remains of divinatory practices. Dice too did not necessarily conform to our expectations. The earliest Greek examples we know of date to the 7th century, and the circular depressions on each face which provide the number could be supplemented with painted embellishments, sometimes figural. If the users of these dice read any significance into this ornamentation, it is lost to us. Unlike later dice, some of these were erratic in that the two opposing faces did not necessarily add up to 7, as they do nowadays on standard dice. The dotted numbers of some dice are supplemented with letter-based signs as well. Another peculiarity of early Greek dice is that some bear 9 impressions where we would expect 6, as on these examples from Corinth. Even more strangely to our eyes are the few known examples of rhomboidal dice. Such pieces have been excavated at the Athenian Agora, at the Korykeion cave of the nymphs above Delphi, and in Pieria, Macedonia. However, in the archaic period, the principle of dice throwing could be applied to totally different non-cubic forms. And here I show a number of bronze dice, in inverted commas, leech-like in form, from the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia in Sparta and the Menelaon, a sanctuary just beyond that city. They are also known from Corinth. These have 6 landing sides, each of which carries a different number of circles, just like their cubic counterparts. These objects of play or divination do not seem to have had any successes, whereas cubic dice are still with us. So, can we answer the question whether Achilles and Ajax were playing, or were they engaged in the far more serious business of predicting the future? We may have been at something of a stalemate if it wasn't for one representation, which, unlike the others, provides a bird's eye view of the gaming block. On a kaiathos, something of a cross between a cup and a ladle, now in Brussels, we see the top of the block, and a gaming board is definitely represented. 5 lines and possibly gaming pieces. Here, Achilles and Ajax, the foremost Greek fighters at Troy, are playing a game, and they may well do so in the other representations as well. And we may remember Pindar's lines with which we started that clearly show how playing board games comfortably conforms to the aristocratic and heroic ethos. So here I would like to open a parenthesis. We have seen that representations of warriors, some explicitly identified as heroes, playing a board game are common enough, and that they constitute a well-defined group. Did the Athenians depict others, themselves included, following such pursuits? There are indeed a handful of such representations, 3 or 4, and they follow the model established by Achilles and Ajax. 2 men intensely focused on the game. There is, however, one exception, and a very refreshing exception at that. Unfortunately, it is only preserved on a fragment of a cup, which dates to about 540, 530. The sherd shows a seated man, the one preserved player, at a table on which a board game is being played. He exclaims, "I have thrown 4, ego de tetara." Behind him, a companion leans forward, enthusiastically examining the board, and we may imagine him offering advice to the player. We have no way of knowing whether this advice is welcome or not. At the sherd's right break, we see part of the back of another seated figure, possibly a part of another playing pair. Despite the fragmentary state of the scene, we can readily discern that its atmosphere is totally different to that of the hero's game. Here, I like to think that we gain a view into the actual bustling gaming tables of 6th century Athens, with all manner of human interaction, which reveal foibles and strengths, gamemanship and impatience. A noisy world, greatly distanced from the hierarchically conceived firmament of heroes at play. But to return to those self-same heroes, they belong to a mythical world, and board games themselves have a mythical pedigree. In the 4th century, Plato wrote that the Egyptian god Thoth invented them, while earlier in the 5th, Herodotus would allow, in a more rational vein, that the Lydians were the first to use dice, but not board games. The majority view throughout Greek antiquity, however, was that board games, dicing, and military strategy were invented by the hero Palamedes, son of Nafplios. And this tradition continued in Greek learned circles into the Byzantine period, as testified to a poem by a certain Constantine of Rhodes, in which Palamedes' board game skills are equated with real-life military strategic skill. Palamedes is often overlooked. He does not appear at all in the Iliad or the Odyssey, and his story has to be pieced together from references in later sources. Clearly, he was a Greek culture hero, a protos evretis, a first inventor, to use the Greek term, who bestowed benefits on humankind. Unfortunately for him, he ran foul of Odysseus, who receives a good press in the Homeric epics, which may explain Palamedes' absence. The reason for the enmity between Odysseus and Palamedes was the latter's great intelligence, though not necessarily cunning, which was epitomized by Odysseus. Odysseus had tried to avoid joining the Greeks in their quest against Troy by feigning madness. Palamedes managed to unmask him, for, as the main version of the myth goes, when Odysseus yoked a cow and a horse in order to plow a field, obviously an act of a madman, Palamedes placed Odysseus' infant son, Telemachus, in the path of the plow. Odysseus' paternal instincts came to the fore, so proving that he was not mad and that his insanity was merely a pretense. Odysseus had no choice but to join the expedition, but he did not forgive Palamedes. An interesting alternative version attributes Odysseus's enmity towards Palamedes to the fact that the latter correctly explained the cause of a solar eclipse, while Odysseus could not. Either way, once encamped before Troy, Odysseus waited for the right moment, and when it came, he forged a letter purportedly from the Trojan king Priam to Palamedes, revealing details of a plot against the Greeks by which Palamedes would betray his companions for recompense. Thereafter, Odysseus secretly buried a great quantity of gold in Palamedes' tent and presented the forged letter to Agamemnon. Palamedes' fate was sealed. He was stoned to death by the Greek army, or in an alternative version, drowned. Either way, Odysseus had wrought his revenge. Nafplios, Palamedes' father, exacted his after Troy had fallen, as he lit beacons at treacherous capes on the Greek coast, thus luring many of his sons' erstwhile companions and executioners to their watery deaths. For those heroes who did manage to return to their hearths, Nafplios had arranged a particularly devastating welcome, for he had persuaded many of their long-waiting wives to take lovers, foremost among them Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, who murdered, of course, the returning king with the aid of her paramour. Let's, though, return to Troy. A late source of the 2nd century AD, Philostratos, relates that both Achilles and Ajax were angered by the Palamedes affair and saw the injustice involved, and consequently retired from battle for a time. Indeed, Ajax ignored the general decision that Palamedes' body not be buried and gave him the necessary funerary rites. While Ajax is not portrayed as one of the most intelligent of the Greeks, he is among the most decent. In a fragment of a play by Euripides, we read that Palamedes made his gaming inventions while the Greeks were bored out of their minds at Aulis, as Artemis would not allow the necessary winds to rise, so the Greek fleet could not sail to Troy until Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter, Iphigenia. Euripides presents Palamedes as playing at the seashore with his fellow hero Protesilaus. Sophocles, on the other hand, wrote that Palamedes made his gaming inventions at the Greek camp at Troy. A tradition even arose that there actually was a stone on the Trojan plain that served as the Greeks' gaming table during the siege. Wherever Palamedes' discoveries took place, clearly Achilles and Ajax partook in them, possibly even when they had temporarily retired after the Palamedes affair. I can't stress strongly enough that any ancient who looked on this and similar scenes would know that both heroes met their death at Troy. Indeed, death was just around the corner. Largely for this reason, some researchers have likened the game played here as to a metaphor for chance, the ultimate game with fate. Who will succumb to the ordained and breathe his last at the next battle? And the ancients would have understood it, could have understood it as such. Some supporting evidence may be provided for such a view that knits the playing of board games with death from the unique scenes carried under the handles of an Athenian cup made in the years just after 550. What interests us here are the winged figures playing a board game, distant analogues of Achilles and Ajax, as we have seen them on numerous clay vessels and other media. Other than their wings, they are also characterized by the kerykeion, or herald staff, which each holds. As with Hermes and heroic heralds, the kerykeion indicates that the carrier is a messenger or a guide, a being who travels and transgresses boundaries, even the most dread, with impunity. Hermes most famously does so in his role as Psychopompos, the guide of the deceased to the underworld. The suggestion most vigorously made by Emily Vermeulen many decades ago is that these four-winged figures are allied beings playing a game of chance and possibly skill in order to determine who will accompany them on their next journey between the realm of the living and that of the dead. Elizabeth Mackay, a scholar who knows more about exegesis than anybody else on the planet, has offered a variant of this death-centered interpretation in her explanation of the gaming scene painted by Exekias. The prize that the victorious hero will secure in glorious, noble death. The hero will secure a glorious, noble death, while the loser will, as she phrases it, ultimately perish in ignominy. Achilles' death came in a suitably heroic manner. Ajax's did not. On the retrieval of his cousin's body, both Ajax and Odysseus laid claim to the great hero's armor, each stating that he was the most valiant warrior after Achilles and so most deserving. So in the top image, you see Achilles' armor in the middle and Odysseus and Ajax practically coming to blows over it. And the central figure is Agamemnon trying to separate them. Ajax, who was indeed recognized as second only to Achilles, did not have a chance against Odysseus's cunning. And he was no orator to plead his case effectively. The Greek heroes assembled under Agamemnon's chairmanship to decide to whom Achilles' armor should be awarded. Details differ to in the various preserved accounts, but each claimant presented his case. And here we see Odysseus on the speaker's platform, Achilles' armor in the center, and Ajax listening to Odysseus. And the two heroes, of course, as you can see, are very helpfully labeled. So after pleading their cases, the assembled heroes had to make their decision. And on the other side of the cup, which we just saw, is a representation of the voting process, as it was conceived of in the early 5th century. Each hero approaches an altar and deposits his vote, either for Ajax or Odysseus. Not only does the layout of this scene formally parallel many of those which show Achilles and Ajax playing at a board, given Athena's central presence, but her altar may also have served as a gaming board, as appears to be made clear by the label of Athena or Athenas in this representation of the game. There is good evidence ranging from Herodotus to Plato and Demosthenes and onto an extensive inscription from Epidaurus for votes taking place at altars. Both voting and gaming incorporate a degree of chance, and so all involved parties would seek out divine intervention and support, and the viewer would claim his success as evidence of his divine supporters' favor. By fair means or foul, Odysseus won the competition for Achilles' armor, though he would later express regret over the episode. We see him gleeful in victory on the left, Ajax in despair on the right, largely cut from this photograph, but I show you a drawing of the distraught figure enveloped in his clothing. Matters went from bad to worse for Ajax. In his despair, he loses his wits and seeks to avenge himself by killing his companions. But in his madness, he simply kills a herd of domestic animals rather than his fellow heroes. On coming to his senses, the shame of the ridicule he knew he would have to face was far too much for him to bear, and he commits suicide. In his world, the only noble way out. And he, of course, knew the only spot where his sword would be able to deliver the fatal blow. There is a reason why the 5th century large-scale painter, Polygnotos, included him in a mural he painted at Delphi, now lost, of course. Polygnotos pictured Ajax with Thersites and our friend Palamedes, all of them whiling their time away in Hades at one of the latter's games, all three enemies of Odysseus. The link between death and board games is reinforced once more. We have seen in Pindar's verses how gaming could be thought of as one of the aristocratic pastimes, more than worthy of Achilles and Ajax's attention. Reinforcing this conception, Euripides, as we saw, has Palamedes and Protesilaos play a board game at Aulis while waiting for favorable winds, and he actually couples their activities with Achilles and Diomedes' athletic training. Board gaming is equally a noble pursuit as are athletics. Life, though, is more complicated, more multidimensional, as we well know. It would be surprising if there was just one consistent view of board gaming throughout the centuries of Greek antiquity. It most definitely could have positive connotations. For those games that were not solely dependent on the luck of the dice, skill was required in how you played the hand dealt to you by fate. There is a reason why the Greeks believed that Palamedes invented both board games and strategic pursuits. Both activities were worthy of the attention of heroes, as exemplified by Achilles and Ajax. And Greek authors, such as the historian Polybius, drew direct analogies between military tactics and board games. Not all commentators saw the situation in such a light. Plato has Socrates state that everyday people, the many, in his terms, ipoloi, quote, can't even teach what is good and bad in regard to playing board games. And yet, I think such topics are baser than topics of justice, end of quote. Board game playing is definitely not among the foremost pursuits of a thinking man, in Socrates' opinion. However, in his laws, Plato endows board game playing with a different complexion, as he states that the creator of the cosmos is a board game player who disposes, quote, parts for the sake of the whole, unquote, as he places different souls in different bodies. Such cosmological metaphors based on board game playing are also evident earlier in the preserved fragments of the Ionian philosopher Heraclitus, in which he writes, time, aeon, is a boy playing a board game. Possibly the divergence in the philosopher's opinion on board game playing may be attributed to who is actually playing the game, the caliber of their character, the creator of the cosmos, as opposed to everyday people. In a rhetorical speech attributed to the 4th century orator Alcidamas, though more than likely considerably later in date, the speaker expresses the negative tradition on board games. In a diatribe against all of Palamedes' inventions, he characterized board games as, quote, quarrels and abuses for idlers, unquote, though he reserves his particular ire for Palamedes' invention of dice. He wrote, and dice, in turn, he revealed as the greatest evil, for the losers a source of grief and damage, for the winners a mockery and a reproach. For the gains that accrue from dicing turn out to be useless, and most of them are squandered immediately, end of quote. And in court speeches of the 4th century Attic orators, dicing away one's patrimony is a stock accusation meant to tar one's opponent as a profligate ne'er-do-well. Similarly, in the differently structured society of the Macedonian kingdom, Philip II is reported to have hidden a dicing board with which he was occupied under a couch at the unexpected arrival of Antipater, one of his generals. At this distance, of course, we cannot determine whether this is a true story or not. It's not as if Philip always received a favorable press. The odium, though, attributed to dicing by the author and the resonance he believed or hoped it would have on his readership is real enough. Board games, though, are not dicing, and they should not be indiscriminately equated. Nonetheless, they could have negative aspects, and it is of interest to note that this negative thread can be traced all the way back to the Odyssey. In Book 1, the goddess Athena, disguised as the Taphian leader Mentes, encounters Penelope's suitors, the villains par excellence, at the threshold of Odysseus' house. Quote, there she found the haughty suitors. They, in front of the doors, were amusing their spirits with draughts, sitting about on skins of cattle whom they have slaughtered themselves, and about them their heralds and hard-working henchmen. Some at the mixing bowls were combining wine and water, while others again with porous sponges were wiping the tables and setting them out, and others cutting meat in quantity. The suitors are transgressors, living for years off Odysseus' household, as Penelope emphasizes, where she again later on in the Odyssey, where she again highlights their board gaming. The cattle that provide the skins they are seated on, the meat on which they will dine, and the wine which they drink are Odysseus's. The suitors have transgressed on all the norms of guest friendship and propriety. They have made a mockery of the mutual obligations involved in the venerable institution of xenia, hospitality. And it is in this wider context that their board game playing can only be seen in a negative light. It may also be a prelude to their fate, for death awaits them at Odysseus's hands. No matter what the outcome of the suitors' individual games may be, they will all lose in their competition for Penelope's hand and ultimately their lives to Odysseus. Indeed, gaming could even be used as a metaphor for describing the suitors' situation in antiquity. Appian, writing in the early 1st century AD, was of the opinion that the board games the suitors played involved capturing the piece termed Penelope, and they spent such a great amount of time in this pursuit, quote, and because of their easy life, the suitors' arms were so flabby that they could not even begin to stretch the bow, unquote, in their competition with Odysseus. And of course, the bow and arrow competition leads to their death. But we return to the question, what game are Achilles and Ajax playing? Does any evidence exist that may be able to shine light on this issue? In the corpus of ancient literature that survives, one text stands out as offering cogent information as opposed to incidental references to ancient board games, though it is by no means transparent. This text, titled the Onomastikon, was authored by Julius Pollux, who held the chair of rhetoric at Athens in the late 2nd century AD, so at quite a chronological distance to the period of production of the iconographic evidence we have looked at. In the Onomastikon, of which we now only have an abridgment, Pollux covered a wide range of topics that refer to life, often viewed through the lens of Greek literature of centuries past. So he did not necessarily have first-hand experience of everything which he included in his compendium. And it is likely that some of the games he describes were no longer actually played. The Onomastikon is supplemented to a degree by the writings of the 12th century Homeric scholar and Archbishop of Thessaloniki, Eustathius, who had access to works of a good number of ancient authors. Pollux provides the names of a number of games, not all of which involve boards, gaming pieces, or dice. Those that did include a game he termed the Holy Line game. Quote, a certain holy line game was among these, which is where the proverb, I'll move the piece from the holy line, comes from, unquote. This game involved skill, as the players had to move their pieces strategically on the basis of the throw of the dice. The game was given, on the basis of Pollux's description, the newly coined named pendegramme, 5 lines, by modern scholars sometime in the 18th century, and is now widely known by that term. And that's because Pollux' main point about the game is that he describes these 5 lines. You will, of course, remember the representation of the early 5th century I showed earlier, which pictures 2 warriors at a gaming table, and which, luckily for us, grants us a bird's eye view of the playing surface. You will note that the board does indeed carry 5 lines. If we see a reflection of Pollux's holy line game here, then the central line is to be identified with it, with the holy line. A stone gaming table at Epidaurus with 5 incised lines is also known, along with others from that site and other sanctuaries, all of which carry an odd number of lines. Far earlier in date is an early 6th century terracotta gaming table from Athens. This piece was undoubtedly specifically made for funerary purposes, as it carries alongside the incised lines representations of 2 dice, and there are traces of a 3rd where it has broken off. Nobody ever actually played on this board. It was made exclusively for the grave. For our purposes here, though, I would note that the board does not carry 5 lines, but 9. It appears that the game was not restricted to boards with 5 lines alone. The important point was that the number of lines was odd. The known examples have either 5, 9, or 11, so that the middle line, that is equidistant from each player's baseline, was the holy line. It has been suggested that the aim of the game was to move all one's counters onto the holy line through a series of moves determined by the throw of the dice. It may possibly have included, according to some, provision for hitting vulnerable counters of your opponent. So it had an element of strategy and calculation. If that is the case, the meaning of the proverb which Pollux associates with the game and is testified to as early as the 6th century BC, "I'll move the piece from the holy line," may, a leading game scholar, Ulrich Schädler, suggests, have been said of someone who is in a desperate situation and is forced to move from a position of safety and so take a risk. Alternatively, the same evidence has been interpreted by Stephen Kidd as meaning the player has taken the upper hand by executing an aggressive, possibly trump move. Whatever the case, a game such as this may well have included elements of strategy and so nicely equates with the characterization of Palamedes as being the inventor of both board games and military strategy. The latter a point noted in Aeschylus's tragedy, Palamedes, named after the hero. We will never be able to know whether all representations of Achilles and Ajax playing at a board game were interpreted by contemporaries as showing a game of 5 lines, but the Kaiathos in Brussels makes it certain that in that instance, that was the case. The Attic terracotta representation of a gaming table on the screen was undoubtedly found in a grave, and it raises the question of what other artifacts pertaining to board games have been found. Possibly the earliest relevant Greek material of the historical period, that is post-Bronze Age, are a series of discs graduating in size from a late 8th century grave at Eretria on the island of Euboea. They have been cut from courseware vessels. These discs have been interpreted as gaming counters, though no explanation has been offered as to their varying diameters. If they are indeed gaming counters, then the temptation to suggest that a gaming board was also placed in the grave with them is a strong one. Its absence from the archaeological record may be readily explained if it had been made of organic material, such as wood, which would, of course, have decayed. Only slightly later is a collection of clay discs, again cut from vessels. This collection was found in an early 7th century context in the Athenian agora. And it is to this period that the first simulacrum of a gaming table cum board, which we know of, was deposited in a funerary context. It was excavated in the Attic countryside at Anagyrus, modern Vari, and it was found with a die. Both were among the contents of a funerary pyre. The board's upper surface is incised with, surprise, surprise, 5 parallel lines. And at each corner, there stands a female figure with her arms raised to her head in the classic mourning gesture. Nobody ever played a game on this board. It was manufactured strictly for funerary purposes, as the wailing women testify. During this period in Attica, the addition of such figures on a variety of objects made exclusively for funerary use is not unique. Another example from the Kerameikos dates to the first half of the 6th century. Its upper gaming surface is now largely lost, but we see here once more the mourning female figures, the mainstays of funerary milieu on Athenian art for centuries. Beyond Athens, archaic period terracotta models identified as representing board games have also been found at the sanctuary of Hera at Perachora, though indeed these may have been board games themselves and not necessarily models. Here the gaming boards are different in nature to those we've seen so far, as they comprise parallel lines of semicircular depressions set in a checkerboard. Round discs cut from pots continue in the archaeological record throughout Greek antiquity. We cannot be certain that they all should be interpreted as playing counters, but the chances are that many should be so identified. We should never lose sight of the fact, though, that other objects could be similarly used, most obviously pebbles and shells. And I should mention here a late 8th century BC grave from Athens, so at the very beginning of our evidence for games in the post-Bronze Age, which I have not shown an image of, given that the image is very, very poor. But it's a disturbed grave, which has a collection of about 6 or 8 pebbles in it, which may well be identified as gaming counters. It has even been suggested that fish vertebrae could also have been used as gaming pieces, a suggestion that doesn't seem so odd once it has actually been made. Effectively, evidence for board games disappears from Southern Greek funerary contexts after the Archaic period, so as we enter towards the end of the 6th century and early 5th. Though the written record evinces their continued attraction, as do such game boards as those found at numerous sanctuaries. A late 4th century funerary stele from Eretria is the only case I know of which shows 2 players at a gaming board, an outlier in this region and in this period, for the use of such imagery in the realm of the dead. The situation regarding the funerary sphere and board games is different in the north, in Macedonia. As early as the 6th century, one warrior at Sindos was buried with a wooden die encased in gold, along with military accoutrement and gold-decorated clothing or shroud. But it is in the 4th century that the relevant evidence becomes abundant. Numerous graves have been excavated which either contain dice, gaming counters, or both. As in the south, irregular dice were rare. I mentioned the rhomboidal die from Aeginion earlier when discussing those from the Athenian Agora and the Korakian cave sanctuary of the nymphs. There are another 2 known examples from Koukos in Pieria, so they obviously had some currency in this part of the world. Similarly, dice with 9 markings on the face, where ordinarily we should expect 6, are also known in small numbers from the polis of Methoni, apparently from a public building complex, though nothing more is currently known of them as they are as yet to be published. As the research of Despina Ignatiadou has shown, most of the known gaming sets comprised of counters and dice derived from graves datable to the middle and second half of the 4th century, and they mainly, though not exclusively, cluster around the polis of Pydna. Typically, the dice are made of bone, and the region was home to a flourishing bone and ivory manufacturing industry at this time. The counters are made of glass, and once more, glass production was a marked feature of the region, though glass counters in this period and the following centuries are known throughout the Greek world. And a factory that produced them alongside other glass objects has been excavated on Rhodes. The only known gaming set in Macedonia that can be dated prior to 350 exclusively had pebbles and shells as counters, rather than glass versions of its later counterparts, though pebbles and shells could accompany glass counters in later burials. There is no doubt that gaming had a high profile among a certain class of Macedonians, as evidenced by these sets. Most of the known boards are reused roof tiles on which the lines required for the game have been incised. One, though, is different. The cluster of graves at Derveni, northwest of Thessaloniki, is renowned for a number of different reasons. One included the charred remains of a papyrus scroll that preserved passages of an important philosophical religious text pertaining to the afterlife. All the graves, though, were richly furnished with premier metal dining and drinking ware of the day. The piece de resistance is a large figured volute crater equipped with an accompanying strainer which served to filter the dregs of the wine as it was poured into it. This crater was placed in grave B, dated to 320-300, along with its other grave goods, which included 20 silver vessels, another 24 of bronze, and pieces of equipment, armor and weaponry, horse gear, and a gold wreath, as well as a gold diadem. Also excavated in the grave was a collection of iron sheets to which wooden remains had adhered. Some of these sheets were found in facing pairs, stuck together by corrosion, so indicating that they once comprised elements of a folding board, which was articulated along hinges. The now lost board, of course, was made of wood, reinforced at the corners by the corroded iron plates. This was clearly a luxury piece, far different in appearance and value to reused inscribed roof tiles or even especially made wooden boards, now not preserved. It may find a rival in a board reported, but not as yet published from Pella, said to be of turquoise-colored faience, a material related to glass, which carries a plan grid of 11 by 11 squares. It is of note that while glass counters were among the items deposited in their Veni Grave B, along with the folding board, dice were not part of the set. One can't help suggesting that the favorite game of the deceased was played without them, and one can think of something along the lines of drafts where strategy is necessary. Evidence in the North for board games and gaming more generally is not restricted to the realm of the dead. I mentioned that dice were found in a public building at Methoni, and there is some evidence of board game playing from domestic contexts as well. Excavations at Pydna have revealed parts of a house, including a room, which is identified as an andron, a room that's specifically designed for symposia and other predominantly male gatherings. Within the andron was found a roof tile reused as a board game. This is the first instance that I am aware of where a board game has yet to be found in this type of room. And this is a very recent find and still remains unpublished, so there aren't any images. I don't have any images to show you. Other gaming boards, either stone or on roof tiles, have been found in indeterminate but non-funerary contexts at Avdira, Pydna, Stagira, Aristotle's hometown, and Phagres, as well as in a small late classical sanctuary at Tempe. Numerous glass counters have been retrieved from the houses of Olynthus, though their precise find spots were not recorded in the old excavations. It is not surprising that remains of ancient gaming activities have been found in settlements and sanctuaries in 4th century Macedonia, but the most forthcoming evidence has been retrieved from funerary contexts, just as it was earlier in Attica, when the burial practices there encompassed the inclusion of model gaming boards alongside other items. In Macedonia, the fashion was to include the actual boards, counters, and dice. Board games could clearly be seen as legitimate, even edifying pursuits of heroes and all those who wish to emulate them, though the latter would have to abide by a suitable behavioral code in order to render the correspondence effective. Penelope's suitors were fated to be exterminated because despite playing board games, they did not follow the statutes of a heroic code. Achilles and Ajax most definitely did. Their game epitomized the transference of the agonistic practice of warfare, where strategic intelligence came to the fore to the gaming board, a relationship underlined by most ancient sources when they discuss Palamedes' invention. Such gaming by such figures was a virtuous pursuit, and those games which involved dice allowed the gods and fate to participate by showing their favor. Death, as an integral part of the human condition, was always present. Analogies could be drawn between death's eruption into the human sphere and the uncertainty of developments as they play out on the gaming table. Equally, though, the quest to be associated with the virtues inherent in honing one's strategic skills by playing board games is evident in the inclusion of board games and their accoutrements in funerary contexts at different periods in various parts of the Greek world throughout antiquity. Despite criticisms aimed at board gaming, but primarily at straightforward dicing, board games retain their positive associations, and so effectively and succinctly illustrated by Pindar's text with which we started, and Euripides' lines in which board games and athletics are inexorably linked. Thank you.
Thank you, Stavros. That was an amazing whirlwind, I think, adventure through board games, metaphorical and real, which I think is really wonderful. We do have time, a couple of minutes for any questions, if anybody has one. Yes, this one.
There are those 10 scenes which actually name them, so they have their names, starting with Exekias's. and we extrapolate from that. No. The names, if you can get the, oops. The figures are actually named. Where the cursor is now is Eandos, meaning of Ajax, and where my cursor is now, well, I can't actually get it yet. Well, behind the other figure's helmet is the name, is inscription of Achilles. No, but they are both, as you can see here, dressed similarly. Well, they're ready for warfare, and Exekius is particularly precise in the detail of his rendering. But on this vase, though you can't see it in this shot, and on many other representations, they both have what are termed Boeotian shields. They're not round shields, but they're like figure 8 shields, which were not used in the historical period and may well have had heroic associations, which would immediately tell the viewer of the time that we're dealing with heroes here. At least that's one interpretation of them.
Yes.
Yes, very much so. I mean, they're abstract nature, and they're obviously there is a degree of uncertainty about them. I mean, we can't control what happens with the roll of the dice, nor can we, despite our best attempts, control exactly what happens in our lives. So that's where both spheres overlap, and it's that's exploited, I think, both by imagery and in literature.
Nicholas?
Do you think it's likely that there was a large panel display about that time? Along the lines of argument about religious capacity. Also, another bit of evidence that the elaborate making of their clothes and this art that's actually copied in sort of panel. And well, that's one question, but I sort of added to the principal thing that you made to panel. So that was one observation.
No, you're definitely right on both counts. We can't, by any means, rule out the possibility that there was a large panel painting in Athens. We know of large panel paintings. We can't demonstrate that to be the fact, though. I mean, but it is something. Oh, sorry, it is something that we should keep in mind. And yes, I suppose the appearance of Athena could be associated with the ever-developing and popularity of the Panathenaic festival. That too is totally a possibility.
We have one from our chat online. So from Athena Dora, how often do we see Ajax and Achilles armed and armored during the board game scenes? Insofar as if we are assuming that they are playing during the period where they withdraw in protest of Palamedes' death, or if these scenes represent a lost episode in the oral tradition where the heroes are so engrossed in their game that they miss their mustering order, then would we expect them to not have their armors and gear ready?
They are armed 100% of the time in all the representations. Now, the rest of the question, I'm not quite sure if I followed, to be honest.
Yeah, it's more like, and I think it is an interesting question that if they are 100% of the time armored, then yes, if they've lost in their game while they were waiting, it kind of helps to think about the fact that it's like, well, yeah, maybe they were all ready to go and then got distracted.
I see.
think
Yeah.
that's what they
Yeah. No, that's possible. But I also think it's important to keep in mind that they may always appear dressed and ready for war to strengthen the analogy between board game playing and the real activity of war. They appear naked, but if they appear naked, they're still probably wearing a helmet or then have their shield by their side, which is enough to warrant them as, in the minds of the people of the day, as being ready and armored for war. Well, variation, maybe the painter was getting bored. No, but the important point is that he has his shield and his spear ready in the scene, ready to go. Yeah. No, you're definitely right. I mean, it reflects the essence of the character of the hero. Yeah.
Any final questions? Yes.
What does the board game say about
that they were played? that I think the literary sources, and to an extent the iconographical sources, though it's very much unbalanced in that we only have that one cup fragment showing non-heroes playing a game. But I think on the broader social context, what that reveals is the, for want of a better term, a certain class distinction between, let's say, in this archaic period, of elites or aristocrats who would like to see themselves, or did see themselves, in the mold of heroic warriors, as opposed to the many people who would be more likely playing their board games in the coffee houses of the day, the kapilia. And that distinction, I think, is very nicely brought out by the image of the non-heroic player on the cup fragment I showed.
the board? Does anyone mentions the board was a regular dimension?
There aren't any regular dimensions that I'm aware of. Many of the boards that we have were in effect just reused roof tiles, which were large. I mean, they're much larger than our roof tiles. And then there are marble boards, of course, and I showed some of those, but again, the dimensions vary. And as Candice showed on Thursday, I mean, anywhere that you could sit down and it was comfortable to play a game, you could inscribe a board, a game on any piece of stone. And I'm sure that, you know, even in the dirt, you could play it. And the other interesting point, I think, I know I've held you too long, is that regarding warriors / soldiers and board gaming, there are many off-period times in a soldier's daily routine. You're not always fighting your enemy. And how do you spend that time? Well, you can either, be told to pick up cigarette butts from the camp's field, or you can end up playing board games. Yeah, that's a question I can't really answer. you need to get a board game specialist. I don't think that. Do you have any? Candice may be better positioned than I am.
It is hard to work out which games and rules have. Nine Men's Morris is the game that was invented in the Romance period that we have definitive proof that it has lasted pretty much exactly the same as is. Even things like Tableau or Backgammon have ancestry, but the rules have changed quite dramatically over a 2,000-year period. But if you go online to a site called Locus Ludi, there's a whole group of European scholars really interested in board games who are kind of teasing out all these ideas as well. And you can follow up there to try and work out which rules you think actually do look like backgammon to you, because it's a really interesting area of scholarship.
Yes. Well, both would have been board games.
Yeah. On that,
Yeah. Yeah, that's turning it around, yes.
on that note, we might leave it there. Thank you so much, Stavros, for that really wonderful talk. That was really fun.